Hello, and welcome to our next to the last week of class. And the lecture this week is Evaluating Public Relations Plans. Throughout the course, you learned many things about writing public relations plans, what goes into a good one, how to implement them. And the last step is really to see how well they functioned, how well they've worked. So this week we'll be talking a little bit about evaluation. Before we get started on public relations plans, let's talk about what we mean by evaluation. And this definition comes from Worthenborg and White. At the most basic level, evaluation is a determination of worth, value, or quality. People confuse the word evaluation with assessment all the time, but here we're using them in two very different ways. Assessments contribute to, but are different from evaluation, which involves a comparison of assessment data with a standard or benchmark to determine quality or worth. So to put that another way, when you're assessing something, you're just measuring it. But when you're evaluating it, you have a set of standards against which you're comparing the progress to see whether or not that standard has been met. So for example, if you look at the two statements at the bottom, an example of assessment might be, how many times has the school web page been accessed? Evaluation might be, how does the number of times that the school web page been accessed compare with the figure for the national average? So when you evaluate something such as the web page and you're trying to get a measure of how many times it's been accessed, evaluation would be comparing that number with another number, such as a national average. You might also compare standards. So for example, when we evaluate students' progress, we're not only measuring it, but we're comparing them against a group of students, for example, nationwide. We're going to talk about four types of evaluation that you might conduct. The first type is performance versus program. And as it says here, performance evaluation is generally used to determine whether an employee has performed satisfactorily. Program is used to determine whether a program has performed satisfactorily. So if you're evaluating a teacher, you're doing a performance evaluation. If you're evaluating let's say the school's AP program, then you're doing a program evaluation. Evaluation can also be formal or informal. Formal is systematic and decisions are based on empirical data. Informal occurs without as much structure and is based on subjective data. So empirical data, what we mean by that is things that you can count or measure with some degree of accuracy. Whereas you could count, for example, the number of days a teacher shows up to work. But if you say, I just don't like that teacher's performance, that's much more subjective and open to interpretation. Of course, the formal assessment is going to be more reliable because you might not have an accurate opinion about that teacher. Formative versus summative, most of us are familiar with these terms. Formative concentrates on the process and is usually ongoing. Summative concentrates on the end product and is usually conducted at the completion of a defined period. So formative means evaluation that's ongoing, that's occurring while the process or program is taking place. Summative measures the outputs at the end. Internal versus external. Internal evaluations are generally conducted by district employees. External are conducted by others such as consultants, professors, or state agency personnel. Sometimes and very frequently, if you apply for a grant, for example, they will require an external evaluator. And it's not hard to imagine why. External evaluation is generally considered to be more unbiased and reliable. Another clarification of two terms it's important to think about, outputs versus outcomes. An output is the short-term result of one or more PR activities. Examples include the number of stakeholders who attend public meetings at the school, opinions expressed on a parent survey, or the success of a parent press conference. Many of you have written these as outcomes into your SMART goals, for example, on your alignment table. I'm sorry, as outputs on your alignment table. Outcomes are the longer term results of a series of outputs. So examples include positive community relations, a better school culture climate, or increased teacher motivation. So for example, in our case study, an outcome that you want to cultivate is increased teacher motivation. An outcome that you want to cultivate is better student achievement. An outcome that you want to cultivate is parent outreach. However, those aren't directly measurable, so we talk about terms of outputs. And that's why I'm having you write your SMART goals in terms of outputs. For example, for the parent outreach, increased participation in parent meetings might be an output. Some essential questions before you begin an evaluation process are who, what, when, and which. And this will help you shape your program evaluation or your PR evaluation. So who will conduct the evaluation? Are you going to conduct it? Will you form a steering committee to conduct it? Will you hire an outside consultant to conduct it? Who needs to know the outcomes? So this might be the Board of Education, this might be the superintendent or the assistant superintendent. This may even be stakeholders in terms of suppose you're budgeting a large amount for a PR program and you have an evaluation that shows some positive outcomes and you want to share that with the stakeholders so they will continue to support the program. You have to think about what will be evaluated. So are you going to evaluate just your school web page? Are you going to evaluate a school newsletter? Are you going to evaluate, as we are in the case study, multiple outputs and outcomes related to morale and other issues? What evaluative questions will guide the process? So unlike when I gave you questions for the interview, you'll have to come up with questions, either survey or interview or other types of questions that will help you figure out whether the outcomes and outputs are being affected. What data sources will be examined? Will you look at attendance records? Will you look at survey information? Will you look at focus group information? Who will you talk to? What standards must be met to determine if a program is successful? So your standard might be a SMART goal that you have quantified ahead of time, for example, or they might be some other type of standard. For example, for curriculum, you might have your own state standards that you're trying to meet. When will the evaluation occur? Is it going to take place in a few weeks? Is it going to occur over the summer? Is it going to occur throughout the school year? And when will the results be reported? And then you don't have to report all of the outputs, but which ones will be included, and there may be some that are sensitive and which ones may be excluded. So these questions will help you think about or begin to shape your PR evaluation. The next thing you need to consider is utility. So how useful will the program be? And so by that we mean the PR evaluation. How useful will your PR evaluation be? So you need to identify the purpose of the evaluation. So including summative and formative. So if you make a plan when you initiate a PR program to have ongoing evaluation, this is really the best because you can take the pulse of the program periodically, say every 3 months or every 6 months, and make course adjustments as you go along. So for example, if you have a focus group that meets every 3 months to provide feedback, that might be an example of formative evaluation. And of course, you'll want to also include a more rigorous summative evaluation. Establish relevance. So this means to link the purpose of the PR evaluation to real issues deemed of value to the district of the school, such as school improvement. Most people won't get behind a PR plan or a PR evaluation unless you can show them, as we're doing in the case study, a direct connection between the PR program and, for example, other things like increased parent participation in the school, increased school achievement, for example. Identify the evaluation methods. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. How will you conduct the research? And the main thing right now to remember is you need to minimize the perception that the method is subjective and self-serving. So what do I mean by that? Suppose you decide to conduct some focus groups, and it's commonly recognized that the people that you put on the focus groups are people with whom you are friendly and who will only say what you need to hear. Well, it might get around school that the principal really doesn't care about how the program is functioning. He or she cares about getting positive feedback from friends. So you want to get perspectives from many different people in many different ways. We're going to talk about again that in a minute. You want to communicate your findings and conclusions. And so this means you have to have a plan for dissemination. How will you get the information out to stakeholders? Will you do a board presentation? Will you do a PTA parent night presentation? Will you put it in your school newsletter? How will you disseminate the findings? Let's talk for a minute about methods, techniques, and sources. There are many different ways you can gather data to determine how well your PR program is doing. You can use direct observations. So you can go into classrooms and count the number of instances, for example, of children's absences. Or you can count the number of times a teacher uses praise, words of praise. You can keep records, again, on, for example, attendance issues might be one thing. You can do opinion polling like we talked about with the referendum last week, door to door or other types. You can conduct focus groups of people with different stakeholders. You can conduct interviews as you did with your two participants. You can do case studies and you can do surveys. These are not the only types of methods, but you can see even with this short list how you can mix it up and get data from different sources. Using multiple types of assessment is preferable, so you don't want to just do a survey. And the reason for that is all of these different methods have their advantages and drawbacks. And if you only go with one, you're not going to overcome the drawbacks of the one method. And you might get biased information, as we discussed with the focus groups. The likelihood of reaching incorrect conclusions is greater when you use only one or two assessment methods. So, for example, you only went out and interviewed 2 participants for your study, and that's because for this class project that was sufficient. However, if you were to do a real evaluation of your school's PR program, you wouldn't want to just interview 2 people. You would maybe want to interview 20 people from all different kinds of stakeholders. And you might combine that with a survey of an even broader group. You might look at, depending upon what your SMART goals were, you might look at record keeping, you might do direct observations. Everything is going back to how those SMART goals are quantified and the type of data you need to collect as you are doing your case alignment table. You're seeing this more and more. The evaluation technique must be tied in to your SMART goal. Relying on multiple sources of data is also preferable. So this means people, for example, administrators, teachers, parents, students, they will all have different perspectives and it will be important to include them. So what does this all mean? One thing it means is that you must relate your evaluation of the PR plan to a standard. So what is that standard? Way back in the first third of the course, there was a slide that you saw that looks like this, how to organize and develop a PR plan. And it said to establish a planning team, define who was being served, define the district or school, establish benchmarks, and then look at the numbers in the red. Develop a PR mission statement. For example, maintain positive relationships within and outside the community. And then 6, establish short-range goals and strategies. Does that sound like something you've seen before? 75% of parents will express a positive view of the school. Yes, these are your SMART goals and objectives. And so if you think about it, when you set up a PR plan, you can use that alignment table to say what you hope to accomplish with it over the next year or two. And then you can think about how you collect the data, how you evaluate whether those SMART goals have been accomplished, and you will have a true evaluation of your PR plan. So again, if one of your outcomes was to maintain positive relationships within and outside the community, one of your goals might have been 75% of parents will express a positive view of the school, and that should probably say between year 1 and year 2, an increase of 10% or 25%, quantifying that increase. You can measure that. So this week's case study um, is one in which an evaluation was really not performed properly. So I would like you to take your thoughts about what you've learned here. Think about what evaluation is versus assessment. Think about how you go about setting up an evaluation plan, how you go about um, doing formative assessment and summative assessment, and be sure to include some of those ideas as well as ideas from your reading in this week's discussion board posting. Thank you.